Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are taking an incredible journey, not, across space or into some terrifying future, but straight into the mind of the man who, perhaps more than any other writer, shaped the 20th century before it even arrived.
That's right.
We are diving deep into the life, the predictions, and the magnificent contradictions of H.G. Wells.
And when most people hear that name, H.G. Wells, they immediately think of his towering scientific romances.
Yeah.
The Time Machine, The War of the Worlds, The Invisible Man.
Of course.
And they tend to pigeonhole him as simply the father of science fiction. But that label, while it's accurate, it's just far too narrow.
It really is.
Our mission today is to understand how he transcended that. We're investigating Wells the novelist, of course, but also Wells the relentless journalist, the ambitious historian, the revolutionary futurist, and crucially, the social critic whose ideas really laid the groundwork for modern international law.
I think the surprise for you, our listener, is just how much this man got right and how profoundly his vision actually impacted reality. It's so easy to focus on, the Martians and the time travel. But the deeper truth is that Wells was operating on a principle that married the fantastic to the mundane. And it's that balance that gave his work its incredible predictive power.
That tension, as you put it, that is the absolute core of his genius. He's sometimes called the father of science fiction, a title he shares, of course, with Jules Verne and Hugo Gernsback.
Right.
But Wells distinguished himself by codifying his approach into something literary critics now call Wells's law.
Okay, let's unpack this concept of Wells's law, because this really feels like the fundamental intellectual engine of all his fiction.
It's simple, but it's brilliant. The law states that a science fiction story must contain only a single extraordinary assumption.
Just one.
Just one. Think of it as a single impossible what if. And once you introduce that one fantastic element, be it a time machine, an invisibility serum, a Martian invasion, the writer must then ensure that everything else, and this is his phrase, remains human and real.
So you ground the impossible in the completely familiar.
Exactly. He insisted on using touches of prosaic detail and rigorous adherence to the hypothesis to make the impossible feel plausible. This is what made his stories feel like tomorrow's newspaper rather than, some pure fantasy.
It grounds the experience, and it's why a writer like Joseph Conrad, who was so deeply committed to realism, could still hail Wells as, and I love this quote, "Oh, realist of the fantastic." And Wells's early training, which I know we'll get to, gave him the technical chops to make this plausible, and the payoff was just monumental. We're not just talking about literary fame, we're talking about real-world influence on things like tanks and space travel. Nuclear weapons, and even the existence of satellite television. And perhaps most astonishingly, his ideas profoundly influenced major political figures, people like Winston Churchill, and later provided the actual philosophical groundwork for the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
It's an extraordinary output for a man who began life struggling just to eat. To truly understand the global visionary, we have to look at the poverty and the intellectual struggle that forged him.
Okay, let's start right at the beginning. Herbert George Wells, born in Bromley, Kent in 1866, he truly did come from the most humble origins. This was not a comfortable middle-class upbringing.
Not at all. His father, Joseph Wells, was a former gardener and a professional cricketer for the Kent County team. And that cricket money was supposed to supplement the meager income from a failing shop they owned.
What kind of shop was it?
It was a little shop selling old china and sporting goods. But the family's financial situation was always thin, always unsteady. The shop struggled mainly because, the location was poor and the inventory itself was old and worn out.
So constant precariousness.
Constant. And that defined Wells's childhood. The situation got dramatically worse in 1877 when his father broke his femur. That injury ended Joseph's cricket career completely and cut off their most reliable stream of income.
Wow. And yet it seems like adversity often creates opportunity. Out of this low point came this defining incident that perhaps saved him. In 1874, young Bertie, as they called him, suffered his own injury.
A broken leg. He was confined to his bed, and his father, to keep him occupied, brought him a steady stream of books from the local library.
And that was it, the spark.
That reading experience was a seismic shift. Wells later described how these books stimulated his desire to write and transported him to other worlds and lives. It was his escape hatch, mentally and spiritually, from the grinding reality of his childhood.
And that grinding reality also included a highly turbulent home life, right?
Oh, very. His mother, Sarah, was a devout Protestant. His father was an avowed freethinker. They argued constantly about religion and everything else. Eventually, they had to live separate lives, so they did remain married.
And Wells himself suffered under the economic necessity of the time. He was shuttled into a series of these deeply unhappy, failed apprenticeships.
Yes, the most notorious of which was his time as a draper's apprentice at Hythe in Southsea. This was from 1880 to 1883.
This sounds absolutely Dickensian. I mean, 13-hour workdays, sleeping communally in a dormitory with other apprentices. This must have been sheer misery for him.
It was essentially indentured servitude. And the key takeaway here is that these experiences weren't just biographical details. They directly fueled his social criticism. When he moved into his realist phase later on, those memories directly inspired his novels of lower-middle-class English life.
Like Kipps and The History of Mr. Polly.
Exactly. Kipps came out in 1905, Mr. Polly in 1910. These books are incredibly sharp, humane critiques of the class system that had nearly trapped him.
But he found a second escape route, not just through fiction, but through this aggressive self-education. While his mother was working as a housekeeper at a manor called Up Park, Wells gained access to its magnificent library.
This was the real turning point. From apprentice to intellectual, he spent hours immersed in classic works, reading Plato's Republic and, perhaps most formative for his later career, Thomas More's Utopia.
So he's reading the foundational texts on ideal societies.
Right, and this foundational exposure to political philosophy and the structure of ideal societies gave his later science fiction its heavy intellectual weight. He wasn't just making up monsters, he was designing societies.
And this self-driven academic rigor, it paid off. In 1884, he won a scholarship to the Normal School of Science, which is now the Royal College of Science, in London. And there he studied biology under the great intellectual champion of Darwinism, Thomas Henry Huxley.
Huxley was famously known as Darwin's bulldog. And this mentorship was absolutely crucial. It deeply influenced Wells's later ethical and social thinking, embedding his entire worldview firmly within a Darwinian evolutionary context.
So he wasn't just writing about the future.
No, he was writing about the evolutionary endpoints of humanity and civilization. This is the intellectual engine behind the Eloi and the Morlocks in the Time Machine.
That idea that society splits into separate, specialized, almost non-human species based entirely on economic class.
Exactly. It's a chilling warning about Victorian class structure, disguised as an adventure story.
So his fantastical worlds are essentially biological extrapolations of Victorian class struggle. That's a powerful connection. Yet, despite this intellectual ascent, he was still physically suffering. He received a comfortable allowance of a guinea a week, 21 shillings, which should have placed him far above poverty.
It really should have. Many working-class families at the time were living on about £1 a week for all their expenses. But Wells recorded in his own diaries that he was constantly hungry and was visibly malnourished.
So what was happening there?
It's a profound sociological contradiction. He had the opportunity and the funds for social mobility, but he was still psychologically and physically suffering from the deprivation of his childhood. He just couldn't shake that ingrained poverty mindset, or maybe he just couldn't manage his money effectively.
But his academic output was stellar?
Oh, absolutely. Despite the hunger, he earned a Bachelor of Science degree in zoology in 1890, and his very first substantial published work wasn't a novel at all, but a serious, 2-volume textbook of biology in 1893. He was a certified, disciplined scientist before he became a literary star.
And he started mixing that serious study with early literary experiments almost immediately. He was contributing humorous articles to journals like the Pall Mall Gazette, mostly as a necessary source of income after he left the science school.
He was also actively engaging with the scientific community. He was among the founders of something called the Science School Journal, and it was there in 1888 that he published a story called The Chronic Argonauts.
And that's the precursor.
That is the clear, rough draft precursor to the Time Machine. The foundations for his defining work were being laid while he was still navigating the science world.
And the industrial world, too. He had a brief stay in Stoke-on-Trent, which was known as the Potteries, in 1888, and he saw the iron foundry furnaces burning constantly over the city.
And that imagery, that terrifying raw power of the Industrial Revolution, is thought to have directly inspired the descriptions of the catastrophic Martian machinery and the destruction you see later in the War of the Worlds.
So his worldview is this fantastic synthesis. Classical philosophy from the library, the raw imagery of industrial England, rigorous biological science from Huxley, and the lived experience of poverty.
That chaotic, rich mix is what gave him the unique perspective to redefine literature.
That blend of the discipline and the raw industrial is the perfect segue. We move now from the unhappy apprentice and the hungry student to the genre-defining titan. He enters this hyper-prolific phase with an incredible 6-year output between 1895 and 1901 it cemented his reputation forever.
This period is just defined by the practical application of Wells's law. He moved beyond speculative stories and created the modern paradigm of what he called scientific romance. He understood that readers of his era were scientifically literate enough to follow complex thought experiments as long as the emotional terrain was familiar.
So the goal was to force the reader to think about the implications of the fantastic, not just the adventure itself.
Exactly.
Let's break down those pivotal scientific romances, because each one is a foundational text, starting with a novel that literally created a new term for the English language. The Time Machine.
The Time Machine, published in 1895, was his first true success. And the key, as per Wells's law, was that single extraordinary assumption: a vehicle that allows an operator to travel purposefully and selectively through time.
And he coined the term.
He coined the term time machine, and the concept became instantly ubiquitous.
And the realism is in the setting. He contrasts this impossible vehicle, the very first example in fiction, with the very solid upper-class comforts of the time traveler's parlor and his dinner party guests. But the real depth, as you said, comes from his Darwinian training.
Exactly. The journey forward is this horrific projection of social stratification. The human species has split into the effete, surface-dwelling Eloi.
Representing the final useless extreme of the leisured class.
Right. And the subterranean cannibalistic Morlocks, who represent the brutalized industrial working class. They are no longer humans. They are distinct, separate evolutionary products of Victorian society. It's a chilling warning.
Then came the quintessential alien invasion story, The War of the Worlds in 1898. The sheer cultural impact of this novel is just immeasurable.
It is the template for everything that followed. Wells planned and wrote it while living in Woking, Surrey between 1895 and 1896, and again, the adherence to realism is key. He set the Martian landings right there on Horstel Common.
In his own neighborhood.
Right in his backyard, using these incredibly familiar, highly detailed English landscapes as the backdrop for impossible devastation.
And beyond the terror, the story contains this devastating social critique, doesn't it? The Martians treat humans exactly the way Victorian-era British and European colonizers treated indigenous peoples across the globe.
Precisely. With utter indifference and superior firepower, Wells turns the lens of imperialism back on the British reader. The Martlands, in their merciless use of the heat ray, are a dark reflection of British military might and the casual cruelty of colonial expansion suddenly brought home.
It's an exercise in empathy by catastrophe.
That's a great way to put it.
Wells didn't just deal with external threats. In 1896, he gave us the Island of Doctor Moreau, which is maybe his darkest and most philosophical exploration of identity and morality.
Moreau is a visceral journey into interference with nature. It explores these profound ethical questions about pain, cruelty, and the limits of human identity. Dr. Moreau is a scientist creating human-like hybrid beast folk through vivisection.
A concept we now call uplift in science fiction.
That's right. And the narrative tension comes from the beast folk desperately trying to follow the law imposed upon them by Moreau, which reflects the veneer of civilization being imposed upon humanity itself.
And the haunting conclusion makes this explicit.
It does. The narrator escapes the horror of the island and returns to England, but finds himself irreparably damaged by the experience. He can no longer shake the perception that his fellow humans are simply barely civilized beasts, prone to reverting to their animal natures at any moment.
So it's a direct critique of the late Victorian faith in social progress, suggesting that civilization is just skin deep.
Exactly.
And cementing his run of iconic figures, The Invisible Man, published in 1897, introduces us to Dr. Griffin. He's the brilliant but nihilistic research scientist who successfully achieves invisibility, but then discovers he cannot reverse the process.
And Griffin quickly descends into enthusiasm for random, anonymous, and irresponsible violence. He realizes the total moral and legal freedom invisibility grants him. He embodies the danger of science divorced from ethics.
A cautionary tale about technological power without moral responsibility, and an iconic figure in horror fiction. His run continued strong into the 20th century with The First Men in the Moon in 1901. Beyond the idea of Cavorite, the fictional material that negates gravity, allowing travel Wells explores astronomical communication.
Yes, he featured the idea of radio communication between astronomical objects, and this was actually inspired by Nikola Tesla's contemporaneous claims that he had received mysterious radio signals from Mars.
Wow. So he's synthesizing cutting-edge science in real time.
Always. And turning it into narrative. It's fitting that the H.G. Wells crater on the far side of the moon was named after him in 1970, confirming his permanent place in space exploration history.
It is staggering that he achieved this dazzling display of new thought in just 6 years, while simultaneously finding commercial success in genres far removed from science fiction, like the realist novels we mentioned, Kipps and Mr. Polly.
Indeed. These realist novels were immensely popular and well regarded for their accurate and sympathetic depiction of the struggles of the lower middle class. And at the same time, he wrote mythological works like The Wonderful Visit, which dealt with an angel, and The Sea Lady, featuring a mermaid. He was never content to stay in one lane.
But the reputation that truly vaulted him into global influence, and which we need to dive into now, is his role as the futurist and prophet. He didn't just invent concepts. He seemed to possess a crystal ball for the political and technological catastrophes of the 20th century.
Without question, his most dramatic and consequential prophetic hit is found in the novel The World Set Free, published in 1914, right on the cusp of the First World War.
What's fascinating is that the book is dedicated to Frederick Soddy, the chemist who proved the existence of radioactive isotopes. So Wells was reading the most complex theoretical science of the day and immediately recognizing its potential consequences.
He was synthesizing knowledge that others hadn't yet connected. And in this book, he writes the first description of a weapon utilizing accelerated radioactive decay. He termed it the atomic bomb.
And the mechanism he imagined was chillingly specific.
It was. Unlike the real-world fission bomb, Wells's fictional bomb accelerated the natural radioactive decay of elements, resulting in explosions that were incredibly persistent, managing to continue to explode for days.
He wrote a passage, didn't he?
A remarkable one, he wrote. Nothing could have been more obvious to the people of the earlier 20th century than the rapidity with which war was becoming impossible. But they did not see it until the atomic bombs burst in their fumbling hands. He saw the technological capacity for self-destruction so clearly.
This wasn't just spooky foresight. This particular piece of fiction had a direct and documented real-world impact on the single most transformative scientific project of the mid-20th century.
Absolutely crucial. In 1932, the Hungarian-American physicist Leo Szilard, who would later become one of the central figures in the Manhattan Project, read The World Set Free.
And Szilard was already working on nuclear physics.
He was, and in 1933, he conceived the idea of a self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction. And knowing the devastating military potential, he assigned his patent for the chain reaction to the British Admiralty to keep it secret from the wider scientific community.
Specifically because of the book.
Specifically. He stated in his memoirs, knowing what a chain reaction would mean, and I knew it because I had read H.G. Wells, I did not want this patent to become public. Wells's fiction provided the conceptual vocabulary and the ethical imperative for the men who built the actual bomb.
That is just staggering how quickly his fiction became blueprint.
It's unbelievable.
Let's look now at his nonfiction predictions. His 1901 work, Anticipations, detailed the world he expected by the year 2000. It was subtitled An Experiment in Prophecy.
And the hits are astonishing. He foresaw the advent of aircraft, tanks, and crucially space travel, and the development of something resembling satellite television. But his most accurate sociological prediction was based on transport.
Tell me more about that.
He correctly predicted the revolutionary effect of motorized transport. Wells argued that the tyranny of the train line would end, enabling people to live further away from their central workplaces, which would lead to the rapid growth of suburbs and commuter belts outside the crowded cities.
So he basically predicted suburban sprawl.
He did. He also predicted the defeat of German militarism and even the existence of something resembling a functional European Union.
Yet the prophet wasn't infallible. The sources note some famous, almost comical misses.
Indeed. He was right about aircraft existing, but thought they wouldn't become truly successful or militarily decisive until after 1950, and he famously asserted that submarines would only suffocate its crew and founder at sea.
So it shows he was always extrapolating based on the technology of his day.
Exactly. He wasn't divining future breakthroughs out of thin air. His failures are as informative as his successes.
Where his extrapolations about conflict were concerned, though, he was tragically accurate. His 1933 work, The Shape of Things to Come, predicted a global conflict beginning in January 1940.
Only 4 months off from the actual outbreak of World War II in September 1939. And the novel accurately depicted cities being systematically destroyed by aerial bombs, which was a horrifying novelty at the time of writing.
He also recognized the rise of dangerous political pathologies across Europe, portraying fascist dictators with shocking clarity in novels like The Autocracy of Mr. Parham and The Holy Terror.
Wells recognized that the political vacuum created by the First World War allowed for the rise of these charismatic, irrational, and highly destructive strongmen. He analyzed that pathology very effectively.
Before these real cataclysmic wars, however, Wells offered a safer, miniature alternative for aggressive impulses. He essentially invented modern miniature wargaming.
He did. In Floor Games and Little Wars, he laid out complex rules for moving infantry, cavalry, and artillery across the living room carpet. The man who predicted the atomic bomb was also essentially the great-grandfather of every kid playing Warhammer in a basement.
That's a marvelous contradiction.
As a pacifist before World War I, he stated that this game was much better than the real thing, calling it an amiable miniature alternative to actual conflict.
That deep compassion and desire for a better system brings us to his role not just as a prophet of technology, but as a persistent and relentless social critic and global thinker, a role he actively prioritized in his later career.
His political stance was rooted deeply in the British socialist movement. He was an outspoken socialist from a young age and a prominent member of the Fabian Society.
And for our listener, we should clarify that the Fabian Society wasn't about sudden revolution. They were committed to achieving socialism gradually through intellectual debate and parliamentary reform.
Exactly. Rational evolution, not sudden catastrophe. And Wells was so committed to shaping the political future that he even stood as a later party candidate for London University in both the 1922 and 1923 general elections. He was a participant, not just an observer.
This political activism led to fascinating and often strained relationships with figures of the establishment, none more intriguing than Winston Churchill, who was an avid reader of Wells's books.
Their relationship went far beyond just social dining. Churchill was profoundly influenced by Wells's ideas. Not only did Churchill borrow specific dramatic lines, famously using the phrase "the gathering storm," which Wells had used in the War of the Worlds, to describe the rise of Nazi Germany.
But the influence ran deeper than that.
Much deeper. Policy influence. Wells's socialist ideas about the supportive state and national efficiency directly influenced a famous 1906 speech by Churchill. Churchill was adapting Wells's vision of government intervention to help the working poor.
And Churchill acknowledged this.
He did. He later wrote to Wells, "I owe you a great debt." Wells's imagination provided intellectual ammunition for his most powerful political opponents. It's fascinating.
Wells was ultimately driven by this powerful utopian impulse, an overarching desire to outline a rational, efficient, and just society. He devoted several major works to this pursuit, starting with A Modern Utopia in 1905.
A Modern Utopia envisioned a worldwide society with a standardized system of knowledge and governance. And delightfully, it had no imports but meteorites and no exports at all. Completely self-sufficient.
And his utopian solutions often involved some massive global shift, like the mysterious gases.
Yes, exactly. In the days of the comet, mysterious gases from the comet suddenly caused people to behave rationally, abandoning a massive European war. Or, in The Shape of Things to Come, a World Council of Scientists takes over after a devastating global war and guides humanity toward a peaceful, technocratic future.
So the recurring message is that profound, often non-democratic societal restructuring is necessary to escape humanity's self-destructive tendencies.
That's it. And to educate the masses for this rational future, Wells embarked on a massive historical project. The Outline of History, published in 1920, was a huge commercial success.
It was revolutionary because it democratized history, wasn't it?
Absolutely. It wasn't written for academics. It was a popularized work of world history written from a secular global perspective. It made him a rich man and spurred many other authors to create their own popular outlines of different subjects.
He followed that success quickly with A Short History of the World in 1922, which was praised by Albert Einstein. He truly saw himself as a global teacher.
And this commitment to universal knowledge culminated in his most visionary and perhaps most relevant concept to us today, the world brain.
This feels profoundly like a prediction of the internet. What exactly did he envision?
In 1936, Wells called for the compilation of a constantly growing and changing world encyclopedia. This wasn't just a big book. It had to be continually reviewed by outstanding authorities, instantly accessible to every human being globally. He expanded this vision in his 1938 book, World Brain,
The ultimate repository of integrated verifiable knowledge?
a system designed to overcome ignorance and misinformation.
Yet, despite this boundless optimism and his dedication to global organization, he collaborated on booklets supporting the League of Nations. The political realities of the interwar period seem to have deeply disillusioned him.
They did. The League of Nations proved too weak to prevent the rise of fascism, disappointing him greatly. He dubbed the entire interwar period the Age of Frustration. His optimism finally shattered toward the end of his life.
And the ultimate expression of that final dark turn came in his last book.
Mind at the End of Its Tether, from 1945. It expressed a shocking, deep pessimism. Wells suggested that humanity's story might simply be over, and that humanity being replaced by another, more rational species might not be a bad idea.
A bleak conclusion from the man who had spent a lifetime pushing for human progress.
Very bleak.
But before that final dark turn, his commitment to a rational, ethical world state left an immense political and legal legacy that persists today.
This is perhaps his most overlooked contribution. His extensive writings on equality and human rights, particularly his influential work, The Rights of Man from 1940, directly impacted foundational international law.
How did the rights of man specifically influence the United Nations Charter?
Well, Wells didn't just write abstract philosophy. He wrote a list of practical, actionable rights he believed were essential for a functioning global citizen. The right to nourishment, to education, to legal aid, to protection from violence. His texts circulated widely among policymakers and intellectuals during the planning stages of the post-war world order.
So as a direct blueprint.
It was. When the UN drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, Wells's detailed framework, emphasizing economic and social rights alongside civil liberties, laid a central groundwork.
So from a working-class apprentice reading Plato's Republic to helping define foundational international human rights law, that is the staggering trajectory of his influence. Now we have to explore the controversies and complexities of the man himself, because H.G. Wells, the prophet of morality and utopianism, was also a notably turbulent and contradictory figure in his personal life.
He was a complicated and messy man. Wells had multiple well-documented love affairs, often overlapping, even while married to his second wife, Amy Catherine Robbins, whom he nicknamed Jane. He was openly progressive about sexual freedom, views that were scandalous for the time.
The sources list an almost constant stream of dramatic relationships that resulted in children and great emotional upheaval.
Constant drama. He had a brief affair with the writer Dorothy Richardson that led to a pregnancy and miscarriage. He later had a daughter, Anna Jane, with the writer and suffragette Amber Reeves in 1909, which prompted a major social scandal.
And most famously, in 1914, he had a son, Anthony West, with the formidable novelist and feminist Rebecca West, who was 26 years his junior.
Their relationship was long and passionate, but fraught with his ongoing infidelities. Even after that, his life remained complex. He partnered with the adventurer Odette Kuhn for years. And finally, there was Moura Budberg, a Russian adventurer.
And she was an enduring presence, wasn't she? The source notes that she cared for him throughout his final illness.
She did, but she consistently rejected his repeated proposals of marriage. She was fiercely independent, a trait Wells admired, but which tormented him. And to document all this inner life, his complex feelings, his political views, Wells turned to his art. He created these little drawings and sketches he called pictuas.
What were these like?
They were often burlesque commentary, sometimes overtly criticizing his marriage to Jane or commenting on his political adversaries. They give us a direct, sometimes raw window into the mind of the man behind the public persona.
Beyond his personal relationships, his religious evolution was also complex and contradictory, evolving over his lifetime from radical non-belief to something approaching a new form of faith before returning to atheism.
He certainly started by distancing himself from the established church, deeply influenced by the scientific rationalism of Huxley. But during his middle years, he went through a major spiritual shift. He defended the concept of a finite God.
A finite God? What did he mean by that?
Well, in his book, God, the Invisible King, he explicitly differentiated this God from the traditional creator or omnipotent deity. Instead, he saw it as closer to a redeemer, the spirit of goodwill and moral purpose that resides within humanity, struggling against the chaos of the universe. This God was limited in power, which made the struggle for progress meaningful.
A modern, ethical, rationalist spirituality.
Exactly.
Yet late in life, that internal spirituality seems to have waned.
It did. Late in life, he considered himself essentially atheistic. This culminated in his most direct attack on organized religion, his 1943 book Crux Ansata, an indictment of the Roman Catholic Church. He launched a strong polemical attack on Catholicism, specifically criticizing Pope Pius XII and controversially calling for the bombing of Rome.
A very inflammatory position at the time. His political fire, however, was also aimed at a more immediate and destructive enemy in the 1930s, the Nazis.
Wells actively and publicly criticized German politics and its descent into fascism. His outspokenness led directly to his books being banned and symbolically burned by Nazi youth in Berlin in 1933.
And what action did he take in response?
As president of PN International, that's poets, essayists, novelists, between 1933 and 1936, he oversaw the expulsion of the German PN Club from the international body because they had refused to admit non-Aryan writers. It was a landmark anti-fascist act.
And his anti-fascist stance earned him a place of high danger in the eyes of the Nazi regime.
He was listed prominently in the SS's Black Book, which was a roster of intellectuals and public figures targeted for immediate arrest and execution during Operation Sea Lion, the planned German invasion of Britain. He was correctly viewed as a massive ideological threat.
Finally, we have to mention a legal controversy that speaks volumes about the challenges faced by writers, especially women in that era, the plagiarism suit of Deeks's Wales.
This was a protracted and bitter legal battle in the 1920s. A Canadian writer, Florence Deeks, sued Wells, claiming he had plagiarized his massive 1920 success, The Outline of History, from her unpublished manuscript.
And what was her claim exactly?
She claimed she'd submitted her manuscript to Macmillan, Wells's Canadian publisher, who then provided Wells access to her work. The defense centered on the argument that the similarities were inevitable, as both were drawing on the same common historical sources. Wells swore he had never seen her manuscript.
And the court sided with Wells.
That was the official verdict, yes. No proof of copying. However, the controversy lingers because later historical analysis suggested the court's verdict was likely influenced by significant bias and prejudice against the female plaintiff. She was a relatively unknown Canadian woman going up against the world's most famous male writer.
A complicated footnote in his career.
Very.
Despite the controversies and the final pessimism of his later years, H.G. Wells remains a monumental figure. He was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature 4 times.
Even without the Nobel, his influence is undeniable. The science fiction historian John Clute called Wells the most important writer the genre has yet seen. He didn't just write within the genre, he fundamentally defined its scope.
His influence crossed generations and continents. He was a touchstone for the heavyweights of American science fiction, Asimov, Bradbury, Le Guin, and he influenced British writers like Arthur C. Clarke and John Wyndham.
And we find surprising admirers in literary circles, too. Vladimir Nabokov called Wells his favorite writer when he was a boy and described him as a great artist, especially praising his social realism novels, provided you ignored his constant sociological cogitations.
That brings us back to their perennial criticism, that Wells was sometimes too focused on the pot of message rather than the purity of the narrative.
It's the constant tension in his work. George Orwell, initially an admirer, became a critic, arguing Wells had become too sane to understand the modern world. And G.K. Chesterton offered the famous stinging quip that Wells was a born storyteller who has sold his birthright for a pot of message.
Whether he was chasing narrative purity or world salvation, his stories have proved incredibly resilient and dramatic, especially through film and television.
The most famous is undoubtedly the 1938 Orson Welles radio broadcast of The War of the Worlds, which famously caused panic. H.G. Wells himself, ever the pragmatist, just acknowledged the stunt had increased sales of one of his more obscure titles.
And Wells himself has become a character in fiction, like in the film Time After Time, where he pursues Jack the Ripper using his own time machine.
It speaks to the deep-seated cultural impact of his inventions.
He died on August 13th, 1946, aged 79. His body was cremated, and his ashes were scattered into the English Channel.
And, fittingly, he had a final, provocative idea for what should be inscribed on his gravestone, a suggestion he put forward in a later edition of his novel, The War in the Air.
The ultimate final word, delivered with his characteristic pessimism and prophetic arrogance.
I told you so, you damn fools. In summing up this deep dive, H.G. Wells' true genius wasn't just predicting technologies like the airplane or the tank. It was his relentless, lifelong commitment to synthesizing scientific principles, ethical Darwinism, and socialist political reform through these thrilling, grounded narratives.
His fantastic inventions were always deeply rooted in real-world concerns about humanity's ultimate evolutionary and political fate.
Always.
We've seen the impoverished draper's apprentice, the disciplined biologist studying under Huxley, the scandalous husband, and the utopian visionary who helped inspire the atomic age and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It is an immense, contradictory, and enduring legacy that defines so much of how we think about the future today.
And that enduring legacy brings us back to his most ambitious vision for human knowledge, the world brain. Wells called for a global, constantly evolving, authoritative encyclopedia, instantly accessible to every human being, reviewed by outstanding authorities to ensure veracity.
And we've kind of built that, haven't we? With massive digital repositories and the World Wide Web, information is universally accessible.
We have. But the question Wells ultimately raises for us as we navigate our daily digital lives is this: have we successfully constructed the authoritative, synthesizing world brain he dreamed of, capable of filtering truth and guiding global rational policy? Or have we simply built a globally accessible world nervous system that just transmits information and misinformation and rumor and chaos without the necessary critical authority and synthesizing intelligence he prescribed?
Something profound to mull over as you navigate your own digital world. That's been our deep dive into the magnificent and messy life of H.G. Wells. Thank you for joining us.